You have probably asked this question in your heart while watching TV, reading the news, and observing your surrounding. You have probably asked this question either verbally or non-verbally. You have asked the question, what is the core problem of the world? The news network that are telling us there are trouble in Africa, there are distress in India, and in the Southeast Asia, there are corruptions going on. You will be the president of the world. What is the first solution? What is the solution that you can implement in solving the problem of the world? Or probably you have not asked this question because for you, you don't really care what's going on in the world. Until you experience problem yourself. You are cheated, you were betrayed, you applied, you were swindled, you applied and somebody fooled you, you lost your savings, your business, and you're saying, what is the core problem of the world? Why is it that after I graduated from college, I have all my credentials, I could not find a job? Allow me to somehow enumerate some of the big words that are causing problem in the world. Maybe we are saying to ourselves, maybe poverty. If we can solve poverty in the world, if we can feed everybody, if everybody will not be hungry, I think that will solve the problem of the world. Do you think there's no problem in America because there are no hungry people? There are more problems. Because when you look at Asia and the Oriental, poverty in the Philippines especially, diba, we see children sleeping on side streets. Is the problem poverty? When the world has overcome poverty and there is plenty and abundance, then there is racism. There is discrimination between people, the young and the old, the white and the black, and the brown and the yellow. Is it war? We are in the 21st century, and yet there is war after war after war. Do you think when people are intelligent and educated, that we will be able to solve the problem of war? Is it corruption? The problem of corruption is all over the world. Or immorality. Do you think if there are more churches, there will be no immorality in the world? The problem of immorality is all over the world. What is the core problem? Charles Haddon Spurgeon, a British scholar, said this because he was commenting about the sins of the world. He said, aren't these just symptoms of underlying illness? Poverty, corruption, aren't these things symptoms of the real problem beneath underlying sickness? Sometimes masakit ang ulo, masakit ang ipin, but this may be symptoms of what is happening inside our body. Charles Haddon Spurgeon said, sin is the mother and nurse of all evil, the egg of all mischief, the fountain of bitterness, and the root of misery. He diagnosed the world and he was saying the world is a sickness that is terminal. And the sickness of the world is sin. That's the root, according to Charles Haddon Spurgeon. We ended with this phrase from chapter 1 of Romans. Paul said, for in the gospel, in the good news, in the evangelion, a righteousness from God is revealed. In the gospel, in the good news, in the royal proclamation that Paul was saying and announcing, in the announcement of the gospel that Jesus said, go into all the world, a righteousness is being revealed. When you're announcing the gospel, when you're proclaiming the gospel, in the gospel, a righteousness, a way for you to have a right standing with God, to have a right relationship with God, is being revealed. So the title of our conversation today, before I forget, is bad news. But we have to understand the bad news in order for us to appreciate the good news. Okay? And what is the bad news? So after I studied again, 18 to 32 of Romans chapter 1. I used to preach this many times when I was a young pastor in Bicol and even in Manila. I look at it differently this time. I asked myself, what is the root of all the ungodliness and evil in the world? I want you to pay attention very carefully. This is the praise or this is the truth that I want you to capture in verses 18 to 32. It is so glaring as Paul would describe and enumerate and argue rhetorically in the scripture of what is the problem and the core problem of the world. Here's the truth that I want you to remember. Turning away from God will result to ungodly ways, to all ungodly ways. When you turn away from God, you don't only turn away once. if you keep on turning away, because God will always appeal before you, and you keep on shunning Him away, and you keep on turning away from God, that will result, that choice and that decision will eventually result to ungodly ways. You do not become ungodly overnight. It is a byproduct of continually turning away from the God who created you and called you. Remember, God created Adam and Eve as an image bearer of God. Now, I want you to picture this, because when Paul was writing 18 to 32, what he was having in mind, according to many Bible scholars, was what happened in the Garden of Eden and how it was projected to the rest of the world. So he's going to describe humanity because of turning away from God, what happened to humanity, what happened to man when he started and keep on turning away from God. So for all of us, if we keep on turning away from God, if we keep on rejecting God, His words, His dealings, His speaking to our hearts, if we continue to remove God from the equation of our lives, eventually your lives, your character, your ways becomes ungodly, and you will notice that you are going downhill in your life. If we continue to turn away, it will result to all ungodly ways. Okay, hold on to your seats. Verse 18. The wrath of God, look at that. It was very heavy for many Bible scholars, even readers today. After saying the gospel of God, Paul did not wait even a single breath. Right away inserted verse 18. If I am proclaiming the gospel of God, I am also proclaiming the wrath of God. And then we struggle in accepting today, I cannot understand that God is a wrathful God. He used the word, very strong word, wrath. He didn't. Some Bible translation rendered it very lightly, and I think in the New Living Translation, it is rendered as the anger of God. But the Greek word support the argument of NIV, the New International Version, because it expresses not only the anger of God, it is really the wrath of God. And you will understand later, but I want you to pay attention to the word reveal. Because again, Paul is saying, just as the Evangelion and the good news is revealing the righteousness of God, it also reveals the wrath of God. Simultaneously, if there's a good news, there's a bad news. If you do not accept the good news, then the bad news will happen to you. There is a choice. Remember, we ended last Sunday sermon with King Herod, who was a former ally of Mark Antony, but Mark Antony was defeated. What happened to him? He made this right choice and smart choice to ally and align with Octavian and Augustus Caesar. Otherwise, he would be put to death. Many Christians today mistakenly read this, saying the wrath of God or the judgment of God will be revealed in the last days. Sa huling panahon, the wrath of God will be revealed. But wrong. Read it again carefully. The wrath of God is not going to be revealed in the last days. It is being revealed. Meaning we can see now, because man turned away from God, keeps on turning away from God, the wrath of God is being revealed today in the heavens against all godlessness and wickedness of men who suppress the truth by their wickedness. Now, there are two words in the Greek. Allow me for a while, bear with me. There are two words in the original translation of the New Testament that Paul had a choice to choose between these two Greek words to use to describe the dismay of God. The first word is the thumos, a panting rage. The second one is orga. Orga is a gradual indignation. The picture here is like a dam. The water is raging, but it is being sustained by the wall of a dam. Pero pag hindi na kaya ng dam, it will burst. And you see the flood and devastation that will happen. Paul had the choice to choose the thumos, but he chose orga. Because Paul was saying the anger or the wrath of God is judicial. It is, in contrast with the Greek mythologies, because the Roman readers were influenced by the Greek minds, Zeus, remember the mythology? Zeus is an angry God. He's a smiteful anger that lagi lang siya nagbabantay, if you cross the line, kikidlatan ka niya. Paul is saying, God is not like Zeus, who had a panting rage that is smiteful in his anger, na always watching. If you cross the line, if you violate something, he will curse you. What Paul is trying to say, the anger and the wrath of God is something that is accumulated It speaks of the long suffering of God and His forbearance. The sin that is not punished in the past. You will read that in chapter 3 of Romans. And Paul is going to build up his argument that God was patient. He was giving us the chance. God was patient. He would not strike us right away. God was dealing with us in a patient and a long-suffering way. But that wrath is judicial and it is accumulating. And you will see that someday you will experience the justice of God. If you keep on turning away from God, it will result to all ungodly ways. Meaning, Paul is saying there's a key phrase there, therefore man is without excuse. The objects of God's wrath are not people. I want you to take this very, very important. God is not angry at you. God is not mad at you. He's not angry at the world. The Bible did not say, for God hates the world so much that He gave His only begotten Son. That's not the picture of the Father. The picture of Jesus showing the Father is for God so loved the world. He loves the world. He loves humanity because we were created from the image of God. But alongside with the righteousness of God, if we keep on turning away from God, it will produce unrighteousness and ungodliness. And because God is just, the judicial anger of God will be met by continually disobeying and rebelling against God. The object of God's wrath are not people, but the ungodliness and the wickedness. That's why God punished sin in Christ when Christ was hanging on the cross. But I want you to picture that God is for you. He is not against you. But if we continue to turn away from God, God will be against the ungodliness. And because you're continuing on that path, eventually you suffer the consequences of what you have done in your life. Now, let's go. Paul said in verse 19, the wickedness, the wrath of God is being revealed today. You see all the consequences of sin in the world. Why is the world in trouble? These are consequences. Poverty, all these things that are happening in the world are consequences. These are part of God's wrath and punishment because of man continually turning away from God. They know the truth. It is not head knowledge. It's something that is inherent. They know the truth about God because He has made it obvious to them. The picture that Paul was trying to show here is Adam. Adam had a relationship. Adam had the picture of God. He knew God. Man, in totality, we know, inherent in our conscience, we know that there is someone creator and higher than all of us. For ever since the world was created, look at this, ever since the world was created, picturing about the garden of Adam and Eve there, people have seen the earth and sky, heaven in other words, through everything God made, they can clearly see His invisible qualities, and Paul defined it, His eternal power and divine nature. So they have no excuse for not knowing God. The whole world, humanity as a whole, has no excuse to say that there is no God. When you look at the sky, the mountains, the river, and the creations of God, it points towards one direction, that there is a creator. Paul said that's why people have no excuse. They know God. And then he said, yes, they knew God, but they would not worship Him. Paul is now building his argument. They wouldn't worship Him as God or even give Him thanks. They would not even honor Him. And they began to think up foolish ideas of what God was like. As a result, their minds became dark and confused. You see, when you keep on turning away from God, it will result to ungodly ways. I want you to think very carefully. The first sin, the root of all sin, is actually idolatry. When you replace God in His rightful place, that's why you are able to do all these foolish things and ungodliness. Because this idol who is dead cannot guide you. There is no morality in this God. When you replace the God who created you, eventually, this will result to ungodliness. Look at the argument of Paul. That's what happened to Adam. When Adam replaced God and turned away from what God has given him and paid attention to the devil and the serpent, the deceiver, what happened to Adam? Adam degraded himself and decreased and declined. And Bible scholars would call it the depravity of man. That's why the journey of man became very, very evil, ugly, until we hit rock bottom. I want you to hold on to your seats because Paul would describe it in the very gruesome way, which may answer your questions in your mind later on. Look at that. They wouldn't worship him and even honor him, meaning they would not even ascribe to God that he is the creator and we are your created being. They totally disregarded God. As a result, because of that action, as a result, their minds became dark and confused. You know why? Because the wisdom comes from God. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. If you lose that fear, then foolishness, lahat ng ginagawa mo becomes foolish because no one is guiding you, God is not overshadowing you or whatever, then your path leads to destruction. We all know that, brothers and sisters. We cannot live without God overseeing our lives. Look at this. Claiming to be wise, for them, to choose their own way is wiser than to choose God. They said, claiming to be wise, they instead became utter fools, completely fool. You know, in the Bible, who are the fools? The people who say that there is no God is a fool. That's what the description of the Bible. Because how can you say there is no God? How can you explain the mountains, the universe, the sky? How can you explain all those things and still believe that there is no God, that there is no creator? That's why the Bible says only a fool believe and say that there is no God. Look at that. Instead, they became utter fools, and instead, look at that. Here's the juncture now. Paul is saying, instead of worshiping the glorious God, instead of turning to God, instead of worshiping God, the Creator, instead of worshiping the glorious, ever-living God, you know what happened? Man, they worship idols. So the idolatry made to look like mere people and birds and animals and reptiles. How can a created being worship another creature rather than the Creator? And they claim to be wiser and smart and knowledgeable. They became fools. Because God is no longer a part of your life, that's why your decision makings are all blunders. In choosing relationship, in investing in business. I'm not saying because God is part of your life that you will not make mistakes, but more mistakes when God is not part of your life. Especially when we are not following His guidelines and His words. Because we can be followers of Christ and not following His words. Ganon din. We all still fall in the ditches of our lives. That's why Paul was able to say, and I was able to say, turning away from God, if you keep on turning away, it will result. You see the key word, as a result. Because they don't worship God, as a result, they become like this. When you start neglecting and rejecting God, you become like this. So idolatry is the evil of all evil. When you replace God, that gives birth to everything. Let's continue. Here's the strong word. Because they wouldn't worship God, you know what happened? So God abandoned them. The very strong word. In the King James translation, it is translated as God gave them over. Wow. We don't use that word, God gave them over today. Sometimes it's more familiar for us, the word abandon. Maybe we are here and it reminds us of something very painful when you were growing up. You know, Pastor Butch, just like my dad, my mom, we were abandoned by our parents. But this is a different kind of abandonment. I want you to remember this very carefully. The picture here is like, the image is like a boat with a string. And the boat is being drifted and tossed to and fro by the waves and trying to get out. And finally, God let go of the boat because the boat wanted to leave. Now, it's more confusing. Actually, the picture that is being used here is like the parable of the prodigal son. When the younger son came to his father and asked, give me my share, I wanted to go. The story was cut short, but there is something that going on there. Probably the father did not just say, why anak? There must be conversation there. But because the son was so persistent, and the father, what did the father do? Let him go. That's the picture of, because you turn away and you keep on turning away from God, as a result, you continue to do this ungodliness. After all the patience and the reaching out of God, because of your persistency, God let you go. So this is the picture of man. Because man is continually rejecting God and continually doing evil before God and would not honor God, the Bible tells us, Paul tells us, God let them go, abandoned them to whatever shameful things their hearts desired. What happened to the young boy in the prodigal son? The prodigal son, that son carries the name of his father, and yet he was living a sinful life, womanizing, maybe having drugs, whatever, gambling, and in those time of the world. And it pains the father, but the father had to let him go. That's the picture of God abandoning man because of your consistent and persistent rejection of God, that you put on punishment and consequences upon yourself. This is not because God abandoned you, He doesn't like you. No, it's different. When God said God abandoned man, it is because man persistently reject God, and God in His permissive will would let us go. Just like the young boy in the prodigal son. Paul, look at the argument of Paul. God abandoned them to do whatever shameful things their hearts desire. As a result, you see, when you keep on rejecting God, this will happen. As a result, they did vile and degrading things with each other's body. Are you ready now to the next line? Hold on to your breath. Paul is now becoming very, very specific and straightforward. I was wondering, did Paul know our issues today in the 21st century when he was writing this first chapter of Romans? Look at that. They traded. Who are they? The people who keep on rejecting God, and God eventually abandoned them, let them go because of your hard-headedness. The permissive will of God, because you like it. In the first place, God would reach out to you, don't do that, and yet because you're stubborn and you wanted to go, God let you go and release you. They traded the truth about God. What is the truth about God in the gospel? That God loves you, that you are created from the image of God. They traded the truth about God for a lie, so they worship and serve the things God created instead of the Creator. Let's look at the idolatry there. When you keep on rejecting God, it will result to ungodly ways. That is why Paul said, God let them go, abandon them to their shameful desires. Even the women turn against the natural way to have sex. Oh, sorry, young people, this is what the Bible is saying, but I want you to pay attention very carefully. Even the women turn against the natural. What is the natural? Heterosexual. The woman will marry a man. But look at the way Paul would describe, they turn against the natural way to have sex and instead indulge in sex with each other. Now tell me if the Bible is not relevant today. Was Paul aware of what is going to be the issue of sexuality in the 21st century? When man kept on rejecting God and turning away from God, it will result to ungodly ways because God is no longer there guiding man. Where do we get now our morals? Where do we get now our standards? If it is not from God's standard. As the men, instead of having normal sexual relations with women, burn with lust for each other, with fellow men. Oh, hold on to that. Pause for a while. The context of Romans, they were under it's more of the Greek minds. As I was reading, the Greeks, the homosexuality and all this immorality that are happening are part of the Greek culture. And usually though po in Greece, what is common in the Greek society is that older man will have a younger boyfriend, if we can call it that way. That was a common practice in the Greek culture. So when Paul was discussing that in Rome, that was a common scenario in that society. According to one Bible scholar and historian, that practice was not originated from Rome or the Romans. It's more of the Greeks who influenced that in that part of the world. And Paul said, it's very, very strong. Because when we keep on rejecting God and His words, eventually it will bear fruit as a result, lead to all these things. And men did shameful things with each other. As a result of this sin they suffered within themselves, the penalty they deserve. We have to understand the bad news for us to appreciate the good news. And Paul is describing how ugly humanity has become because of they keep on turning away from God. Mga kapatid, kung tayo patuloy na umaayaw sa bidding ng Diyos sa atin, if we keep on turning God away and rejecting God and His words, where do you think your life and my life will go? Without God's guidance, His morals, His directions, without the word that shines the light of our path, without the word that lights the ways of our lives. That if we do not acknowledge God, He will make our path straight. Where is that in our life? If we do not acknowledge God, then our ways are crooked. Because the promise is, do not lean on your own understanding, but in everything you acknowledge God and He will make your path straight. You see, if we keep on disregarding God, turning away from God, just like what Adam did, because what Adam did eventually resulted to all these things that we are experiencing today. It's so heavy, when I was preparing this sermon, I go, wow, I don't want to offend any one of us, but Paul is describing how ugly the world has become. That's the core of the problem. Since they thought, look at that, since they thought it foolish to acknowledge God, how can, they even thought that it's, why worship God? Why go Sunday? Why do you read the scripture? Why don't even believe in God? It's foolishness. Since they thought it's foolish to acknowledge God, it didn't happen one time. It's a recurrence. God let them go. God abandoned them to their foolish thinking and let them do things that should never be done. When we keep on turning away from God, it will lead or result to all ungodly ways. The core of every evil is when we replace God in our lives. Their lives became full of every kind of wickedness. Maybe we're saying, Pastor Butch, I am not part of that category that Paul was describing. Oh, hold on to your seats, because Paul would now encompass everybody. He said, their lives became full of every kind of wickedness. And then sin, greed, hate, and envy. Envy, murder, quarreling, deception, malicious behavior, and gossip. If we keep on turning away from God, Paul described all these things as ungodliness. If God is no longer sitting on the throne of our hearts, who's guiding us? Ourselves? Then that's idolatry. Anything that replaces God falls to idolatry. That's the first and the root of everything. When Adam replaced God in His rightful place, Paul described humanity in its downgrading and depraving state. They are backbiters or backstabbers, haters of God, insolent, proud, rude, boastful. They invent new ways of sinning and they disobey their parents. Oh, young people, maybe you're saying, I'm not part of that, Pastor Butch. But look at the last line. They disobey their parents. Oh my goodness. I am not idolatrous, Pastor Butch. I don't do all those things. But Paul included all of us. They invent they're not satisfied. They keep on inventing new ways of sinning. They disobey their parents. When we keep on turning away from God, because it is God who says, honor your parents, obey your parents in the Lord. So if you keep on turning away from God, then who guides us? Who directs our lives? They refuse to understand, break their promises, are heartless, and have no mercy. Now, Paul was writing and including actually verse 18 of chapter 1, Paul argued until chapter 3, verse 19. He argued from the perspective of the whole humanity, from Jewish people, and from the whole humanity. And then he will introduce the gospel that I preached, not guilty. Remember chapter 3, 21? That's when Paul was saying, all these things are happening because of man replacing God and keep on turning away from God. But the gospel, the proclamation is revealing a new righteousness because all of us are not right with God. We need to be right with God. And the only hope we have is the preaching of the gospel, which carries a righteousness from God. The last verse, look at that. They know God's justice requires that those who do these things deserve to die. The translation of that in chapter 3, for all have sinned and come short of the glory of God, for the wages of sin is death. That's the translation. The justice of God requires that all who disobey have to die and sin. Yet, they do them anyway, deliberately, even though they know Now, Paul is now referring, even if you're Jews, you know the law of God, and you keep on deliberately disobeying God, you know that there is a requirement to it, that God's wrath, God's judgment, no one has an excuse. And then he added this last line that made it more heavy for us. Look at the last line. Worse yet, worse than all those who are doing all these things, the worst is when you approve others in doing it. They encourage others to do them too. Not only you're doing it, you're now influencing others to do it. That's the worst. When you are not only the user, you become a pusher. It all starts as user. You use it first, but you destroy others and approve and go. Paul said, worse yet, if you're not just disobeying your parents, you're a malicious talker, you're proud, you're exchanging the truth of God, you're practicing immorality, and so on. If you are doing this and yet you also approve others to do that, that's worst. In translation of the King James, you condone and you tolerate other people. Meaning instead of preaching the gospel for them to have a way of comparing the truth of God, instead of you're not preaching the gospel, you are actually endorsing to continue to do that. Yeah, that's good. Keep on doing that. How are you today, brothers and sisters? You see the ugliness of the world? That's the bad news. Going back to my question, what is the core problem of man? The core problem of man is that we turn away from God. That's the root of everything. Because when we turn away from God, it will result to ungodly ways. Now, the picture of Paul is Adam. You can eat all fruit in the garden, Adam. You are my apple of my eyes. You are the created from my image, Adam. Rule and subdue and manage. And yet, Adam, of all the knowledge about God, turn away from God and listen to the deceiver. And because of that sin, the world became ugly and destroyed. But the good news is, Jesus came and redeemed the world. And he said, go into all the world. That's why the gospel revealed a righteousness from God. But it also reveals the other side, which is the wrath of God. If man keeps on rejecting and turning away from the good news, from what God has done, that will lead. And Paul painted the picture of humanity. That's why man, the world is cursed. It needed to be redeemed. I end with this. Probably you want to read it again tonight as you go home, but pay attention to these phrases. These are the arguments of Paul. Instead of worshiping God, honoring and giving thanks to God, they honor a false God. They worship other gods, even themselves. So God abandoned them. Because you keep on rejecting God, God let you go. The picture of this young boy in the prodigal son who kept on saying, I want to go out, Father, I want to be on my own. And the Father let him go. God abandoned the world. Not because He wanted to abandon us, but you are so persistent in your rebellion before God. And because God abandoned us, no one is overseeing our lives. What happened to us? As a result, we are doing a lot of shameful things, depravity of our lives. The image is destroyed. The world is ugly. So your take home. Turning away from God. Intentionally, I use the word turning. It's a progressive, it's an ongoing. You don't turn away from God once. If you continue to turn away from God, if you continue to shun God away, what do you expect to happen in our lives? The opposite is true. When you and I turn to God and keep on turning to God, reading His words, abiding in Him, our lives become godly because there is God's guidance and oversight of our lives. Now it's a choice. I hope that we don't turn away continually from God. So here's my challenge. Honor God, your Creator, because He created you from His image. You are supposed to be the image bearer. We're supposed to be like the mirror that reflects the sun, that reflects back to God. We are supposed to be the representative of God in this world to show what God is like. But if we keep on turning away from God, ungodliness. And the ungodliness will be punished. And you know what? The godliness and sin has been punished in Christ. But if we continue to do it, Paul said, you will suffer the justice of God at the end. But even today, if we keep on rebelling against God, the consequences is on us. Not because God is against us. He is actually for us. He's for you. That's why He gave His Son. I want you to remember this as we invite Joy to sing, that God is actually not against you. He's not against us. He is for us. That's the royal proclamation. The good news may be because the world is ugly, but remember, we will only be able to appreciate the good news if we understand the bad news.
So constant, so